Welcome to Modern Education, the show that dives into all things relevant to learning. Modern Education has a guest each week for an in-depth conversation about some aspects of teaching and learning. Join the host of Modern Education, Benjamin S. Woodford, as we continue to evolve the important topics for effective learning today. We will unpack the ways community members, students, teachers, parents, and researchers approach learning in all its forms. And now, introducing the host of Modern Education, Benjamin S. Woodford.
Welcome back to Modern Education. I'm your host, Ben Woodford, and we're here again with another exciting talk. My guest today is Michael McFaul. He's a professor of political science, director and senior fellow at the Freeman Spongler Institute for International Studies, and the Peter and Helen Bing Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. He joined the Stanford faculty in 1995. He's also an analyst for NBC News and a contributing columnist to the Washington Post. Dr. McFaul served for 5 years in the Obama administration, first as special assistant to the president and senior director for Russian and Eurasian affairs at the National Security Council at the White House, then as a U.S. ambassador to the Russian Federation. He also has authored several books. His current research interests include American foreign policy, great power relations, and the relationship between democracy and development. Dr. McFaul's latest book is called From Cold War to Hot Peace, an American ambassador in Putin's Russia, and it's coming out spring 2018. I'm going to bring Dr. McFaul on the line, and we'll start our conversation. Dr. McFaul, thank you for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, absolutely. It's so exciting to have you here. The honor is really all mine.
I've been a big fan of KZSU for a long, long time.
Really?
Over 35 years.
Oh, man, that is an honor. I mean, we have such
It's on my radio dial on my car right now.
Oh, awesome. And hopefully everybody who's listening totally understands that. So, you're widely considered a leading authority on Russia and international relations. You've authored several treaties and things like that. I'm wondering if you could give us a story about how you became interested in the region and sort of developed this love that you're well known for.
Yeah, thanks for asking the question, because it's kind of a strange story. I grew up in Montana. Not very worldly person at the time. Never been abroad, never been to California until I came to Stanford as a freshman. My junior year of high school, we moved from Butte to Bozeman, which probably means nothing to you, right? And nothing to most of your listeners. Two B towns in Montana, but the difference between Butte, which is a pretty tough mining town, and Bozeman, which is a college town, had a huge impact on me. And I got more interested in intellectual academic things, and I joined the debate team. And the year that I joined, the resolution was the U.S. should improve its trade policy. And so my partner and I ran a case about, it's a very obscure thing, amending the Jackson-Vanik Amendment to the 1974 Trade Act to increase trade with the Soviet Union. That was our case. By the way, my former debate partner is now a senator from Montana, Steve Daines. So we were pretty good as a debate team. He's a Republican, I'm not, but we were a good team. So that's what sparked it. And when I got to Stanford as a 17-year-old kid in 1981, kind of the height of the tensions, Ronald Reagan had just become president. They called it the second coming of the Cold War. And I was alarmed by it. I was scared by it, to be honest. And so fall quarter of my freshman year, I took two courses that changed my life. One was first year Russian, and the second was a course called How Nations Deal with Each Other. Professor Steve Krasner, who's still on our faculty, he taught that. And that was it. That was the interest. And I had this theory that if we could just get to know the Russians, or the Soviets, as we called them back then, that would help to decrease tensions. And so sophomore summer, I took my first trip abroad ever to Leningrad. Back then we called it the Evil Empire. Imagine what my mother thought about that in Montana. You know, she was worried I was going to go live with all the, long-haired communist hippies in California. Right. I came home with very long hair, by the way, after my first year here, and she was worried about that. And then my second year, she's like, "You're going to the Evil Empire?" But I did, and that was really the moment. It was, there's nothing like seeing a country to have a better understanding of it. And over the next 30 years, I've lived many parts of my life. I think I've added it up 6 or 7 years of my life I've lived in that country.
Wow.
The last being the 2 years as the U.S. ambassador.
Right. Wow. So what I'm hearing is this sort of formative experience with a very simple, like a school project with a friend.
Yes.
Created just a little bit of interest or intrigue into the region and the issues.
That's right.
And that has blossomed into a life's work.
Yes. I didn't think at the time it was going to, but, really those early years here at Stanford, and I had tremendous professors, Alexander Dolan in the history department, Alex George in political science. They both passed away, but at a very young age, they were great mentors to me. I didn't have a lot of money, so they even kind of subsidized my research to help me along in this path. And I've actually tried to get away from Russia from time to time in my academic career and political career, but it keeps pulling me back.
What are some of the things you've tried to do to get away from it? What are the interests that you tried to follow and kind of ended up coming back to?
Well, so I had this deep interest in the Soviet Union because of the conflict of the Cold War, right? Mm-hmm. And then as the Soviet Union fell apart, I was there as a student again in 1991, 1990-91, the academic year. I was at Moscow State University, MGU. I have my T-shirt. MSU is Montana State University and Moscow State University. I got both those T-shirts.
Oh, wow.
But that was a very invigorating time for me because I also have this deep interest in democracy, democratic transitions, and that was a very hopeful time. And so I got more politically involved. I mean, before I was more academic, and then I switched. I joined a non-governmental organization back then whose job is called the National Democratic Institute. Their job is to support democratic transitions. Right. So that sustained for a while. In the 2000s, things went awry. Putin came in. There was rising autocracy. And so the Cold War was over. That was a good thing. Mm-hmm. My interest in that had fallen off. The prospects for democracy seemed trapped, and they still are to this day. And so I broadened my horizon to teach, as you mentioned. I used to teach a big lecture course here on democracy development and rule of law, which looked at all countries around the world and lots of history. Later, I did a big project on Iran with my colleague here, Abbas Milani, in the 2000s. But it was really, again, Barack Obama's campaign in 2006 when they reached out to me and said, we need a Russia guy. We want you to do it. And I said, well, what about broadly just having somebody to advise about democracy more generally? And they said, you can do that on the side, but we really need somebody to work on Russia. So first I joined the campaign, and then we won, and that's how I ended up at the White House.
So the president called you and said, hey, we want you to help with this.
To be more precise, it was somebody else. It was Susan Rice is her name. Okay. Another Stanford grad. We were in school together here, and then we were in school at Oxford together. And it's a good story about Stanford, right? Stanford Mafia. She called me up, and I had actually volunteered in a pretty low capacity for another presidential candidate in 2004. I'm even too embarrassed maybe to mention his name because, he flamed out with his pretty haircuts and other things like that. John Edwards is who it was. And I said to Susan, well, I have some loyalty to this other campaign, and he was planning to run again in 2008. And Susan's kind of blunt, and she's a close friend of mine, so she can be blunt with me. And she said, you got to be kidding me. This guy is one of the smartest people I've ever met. He is going to be the next president of the United States, and you should jump on this train now. And I had not really known much about Senator Obama. I'd seen his speech in 2004 on TV, incredible orator. But it was really because of Susan's conviction, not because of my research about his policy positions that I joined. And it was a ride of the lifetime. I mean, I deeply, that election itself was such a hopeful time in America. And it was just such a great thing to be a part of it, to be at the Democratic Convention. And, it was in Denver in this stadium, and this guy was really inspirational. Then we won. And the transition was a little rocky, a lot of fighting of who's going to get which jobs, but I ended up, getting this job working at the White House. Day one, January 21st, 2009, that was my first day of work. And, as I talk about in the book, we made mistakes and things didn't work out the way we wanted, but on certain issues. But man, it was a honor of a lifetime to work for President Obama. I feel deeply grateful to that phone call that Susan Rice did for me.
Absolutely, and I love the part about the story about how your friend sort of just
trumps
said,
everything.
"You're going to do this," and you trusted her, and it turned into something amazing. And it really speaks to the value of those social connections and the trust that people can influence us to do things.
It's a good lesson. It's a good story. I met her when I was, 20 years old as a Stanford senior. So,
right.
Had a big impact on my life.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And a lot of people's lives. In fact, I think Obama has really changed the conversation in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
It's been powerful.
Good point.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk a little bit just about education. So first idea is, what are the kind of things you wanted to make sure your own kids knew? Maybe we could talk about diplomacy or international or just foreign relations or just interpersonal relations.
Yes.
Yeah. So what are some of the things you really wanted to instill in your own children?
Well, I'll get to that, but the first thing I want to say, I am a product of what education can do. I was... I grew up in fairly modest means. My father was a country western musician. My mother was an administrator at the university. The day I picked up the application to Stanford, and prodded by my, another thing about friendship, Steve Smith is his name, my chemistry partner in my junior year. And, for me moving to Bozeman, that was like the big city. And I really wanted to go to Montana State. I was hoping I could go there. And Steve was always like, oh, no, you got to go see the world. You got to educate yourself. You got to expand your horizons. And so one day we walked down to the counselor's office. I picked up the application and it said Stanford, CA. And I was confused by that. I was like, Connecticut? Because I just assumed Stanford was where all those other Ivy League schools were. So it gives you a little bit of sense of how out of the blue I got in. And if not for financial aid, I wouldn't have come. I'd planned to go to McAllister College. That was my dream. I got in. It was cheaper for me to go to Stanford. And that just transformed my entire life. I mean, without that, I would have done something very different. So education really is the equal. It can bring opportunity, and I feel deeply indebted to that. That Stanford did that for me and took a chance on me. My scores were way below. I was in the bottom 10th percentile on those stupid SAT scores. Somebody took a chance on me, and I thank them for that in admissions. For my own kids. They moved to Washington with me. We left Paradise here and went to Washington for 3 years, and then they signed up for another 2 years in Moscow. And that was difficult for them. I don't want to remind people that it is hard to move, especially my oldest son, who was in high school at the time when we moved back here. But I knew that just as the experience of living overseas when I was a young Stanford student changed my life, that spending a couple years in Moscow was going to have a big impact on the way they saw the world. And it did, in a couple of ways. One, you see your own country in a different perspective when you're living abroad. It sounds stupid and banal to say, but until you've done it, you can't experience it. Number two, they developed a deeper appreciation for European history because of so much history that has happened in that part of the world. And, things like, because the anniversary's coming up, we call it the end of World War II. They call it the end of the Great Patriotic War, May 9th. And, we learned, and I most certainly as a kid in Montana learned about World War II from one perspective and the heroic role that America played. Well, living in Moscow, you get a pretty different perspective of who won that war and who sacrificed and who defeated Stalinism, fascism, and that was great to see that and for them to experience just an alternative perspective. And then three, we were there at a time when U.S.-Russian relations took a turn for the worse, right? Nothing to do with me personally. That happened. And in their school, the Anglo-American schools, suddenly everybody knew they were I have two sons. One's a sophomore here at Stanford and one's in high school still. Suddenly they had to represent America in some weird way. And even sometimes we're asked to speak on behalf of all of you. Well, what do the Americans think, Cole? And suddenly you're like, well, who nominated me to speak for, 300 million people? Yeah. But that was a good experience for them to think about what that means to represent and what it means when people have, and in our case, I would say, lots of disinformation about what the United States was happening that time. For them to struggle with that, they learned a lot from that.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're really speaking to the social aspect of being immersed in this other country with other ideals and having to sort of think about where they came from and where they are going and how they fit into that whole puzzle has been really transformative for them as a worldview.
I hope so. I think so. I hope so.
Yeah. So that, again, it speaks to that experience of getting outside of your comfort zone.
Exactly.
And doing things that allow you to kind of build up this bigger view of the world.
That's right.
Yeah. What about how has all of this maybe influenced your approach to being a teacher or advisor or professor within your duties here on campus?
That's a great question. So I teach courses on American foreign policy, for instance. I teach a course right now called Russia in the West. And I think in terms of my academic work, right, I still I just published a peer-reviewed journal article. It just came out last week, so I'm still trying to keep my oar in conventional social science and keep engaged with that. What I see in terms of the impact on my academic work is, and this won't sound surprising, but I see it in what I write, is after 5 years in the government, I see the role of individuals and decisions as having a bigger impact on history than I would have said to you, before I joined the government. Because we have theories about how states behave, and all states kind of behave the same way, and it's the balance of power between states that cause outcomes. That's called realism. It's a big theory. And actors and individuals don't play a role in that. It doesn't matter who's the president. It doesn't matter who's in Congress. It doesn't matter who's the ambassador. There's the state of the United States and the state of Russia, and they're clashing around the world. And being up close and personal, watching decision-making, especially when I worked at the White House, sitting in the White House Situation Room when we're making momentous decisions about whether to, intervene in Libya or not. I was there for that. Whether we're doing sanctions on Iran or not. How to negotiate a new nuclear weapons agreement. It was a big piece of what I did in 2010. And I saw contingency. I saw that it mattered that President Obama was the one sitting at the head of the table, that he had a perspective on things, and the counterfactual of somebody else being in the chair would have impacted the policy in a different way. And I think our theories in social sciences are not very good at picking that up because it requires a lot of very fine qualitative information that's hard to come by. But most certainly in my own teaching, I try to underscore these possibilities that it's not just structures that determine outcomes, that actors play a role as well.
Oh, wow. That's powerful. I got chills thinking about what this can do. I mean, if you think about you want to look at structures and look at things because those are easy to measure.
Understand them, and they're easy to measure. That's a very good point.
And measurement gives us some piece of information, but you're talking about this personal and interpersonal connection. I mean, similar to the story you just shared about being involved with the Obama administration was really connected to an individual person speaking to you as a familiar person they knew.
That's right.
And it sounds like a similar parallel you're talking about for these government decisions and these big things that happen.
Yes.
They come down to that personal level and that individual connection and understanding.
Yeah. Individuals matter.
Yeah.
Now, how to measure it, I'm glad you used that word, because that's the tricky part, right? And that's why we in political science, if we don't have a way to measure what we're trying to see as a independent variable, as something impacting an outcome, we shy away from it. But that's a mistake. Sometimes we have to use proxies. We have to have approximations of the values, and without question, my research and my way of thinking about outcomes in international relations have been affected by my time in government.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like it's a great takeaway in any field you're working in if you recognize that dynamic is probably true everywhere you go.
I think it is. And I also, as an advisor to students, right, I have advisees. It's also a good story about your own career, like that individuals can matter. And I think out here sometimes in the Silicon Valley, there's this pretty negative attitude towards the government, and those are not good jobs, and nobody has any impact. And particularly the State Department has that reputation. I'm going to punch visas for 2 years, and why should I do that? I'm a Stanford student, and I'll be honest that I did not appreciate the role that people in the State Department can play. But I try to encourage people to think about those jobs because they can have an impact. And I came away with a much deeper appreciation of what our State Department does, what our diplomats do, and I value that work a lot more, and I'd like to see more Stanford students think about that kind of public service.
Yeah. Now, I think that is a great transition to my next question, which is really about the role you see education playing in the international relationships and building these mutually beneficial economic and social ties between countries. Where do you see education fitting in all that?
Well, it's fundamental that as we as a country make foreign policy, and I would say the same if I lived elsewhere, that we don't make decisions based on bad information about other countries. And I witnessed that many, many times in the government. Assumptions about, I was very involved, for instance, in the Arab Spring in 2011 when I worked at the White House. And I don't want to be so blunt, but we just didn't have enough experts on Tunisia and Syria and Egypt and Libya. I'd look around the room or Yemen and Bahrain, and we have to invest in that. And that granular information, that understanding coalitions inside Bahrain, we needed that, and I felt like we didn't have enough of that, and so. And we've kind of moved away from that kind of expertise, right? Our theories want to generalize. We want to treat all countries in a data set. We don't want to know the specifics about the difference between Yemen and Bahrain. We just want to treat them in a regression. And there's a time and place for that. I fully appreciate that, but I think we've gone too far, and we need to train people, in history and anthropology and languages. My time in government, when people ask me, well, what was useful to you in terms of your own education? Without question, the two biggest assets I had was that I could speak Russian and that I knew the history. I knew history. That empowered me in the policy-making process. And granted, I had a boss like Barack Obama who valued education, right? That helps. He's a pretty intellectual guy himself. But for me, that was just a huge upside to be able to do those things and have those skills. And the one thing, we're going to have conflicts with countries. We have conflicts with Russia right now, and sometimes those can't be avoided. But what we can't have is conflicts based on bad information or misperception. And that happens when we don't have enough knowledge about the other. And I always felt that, but after 5 years in government, I feel it even more strongly. And we're falling down as a country. We're not investing in that kind of education. And, we had more resources devoted to it during the Cold War. We've kind of gotten out of those habits, and I think we need to get back to them.
Yeah. I'm thinking about, I think the term is high modernism, right? It's looking down from a bird's eye view and just kind of grabbing the statistics and using that to make all the decisions.
Right.
And what you're describing sounds like a lot more emphasis on the personal, interpersonal, the kind of qualitative understandings of what's happening.
That's right. We got to have both.
Right.
But the pendulum swung too far in the opposite direction. And I think that qualitative knowledge of countries, at least for diplomacy, other fields it would be different, but for diplomacy, you got to have that. You got to be able to understand. Again, you don't have to agree with the perspective of the diplomat on the other side of your table, but you need to understand where their hypotheses and where their analytic frameworks have come from, and oftentimes that's history and culture.
Yeah, and I really love the piece that you mentioned too, just about having the language and having the historical knowledge, and how that enabled you to be able to start having these conversations and be an active participant, not as an outsider who can't speak the language. I mean, that alone is so important, because if you speak the language, you've shown that you've invested in that country and those people enough to be part of whatever conversation's going on.
Yeah, and I benefited tremendously from that. The respect that you show when you try to learn somebody's other language, and Russian's a hard language, by the way. So there's a high bar to get over to be conversant. I made mistakes sometimes as ambassador and in speaking, and they got me in trouble. But for the most part, people were appreciative that I was, being respectful of their culture by speaking their language. I spoke Russian more than most ambassadors. Most, you can get in trouble, and I decided to lean in and just, mix it up. And I would be on radio programs and on TV giving speeches in Russian. I even gave some lectures in Russian, hour-long lectures. And I made some mistakes, but I think on the most part, people appreciated the effort.
Yeah, and I think that's true in every context. Even just a few words to introduce yourself in another language shows that you're not just I think there's almost a perception of Americans just sort of blundering through the world, assuming everyone's just going to speak English. Right. And that effort means something.
Can mean something,
yeah, absolutely. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about your latest book. Okay, so it's called From Cold War to Hot Peace, an American Ambassador in Putin's Russia. It's coming out in spring 2018, and I've only been able to get a hold of some reviews, but they said it's amazing. Every review I read said it was a riveting read and really engaging and great stories and everything. I'm wondering if you could give us a little teaser maybe about one of the stories from the book, get people's palate wet so they'll go out and finish the book.
Well, so the book is really 3 stories wrapped into one. So the big story is about the Cold War ended. We thought we were going to have a closer relationship with Russia. We're now in this confrontational phase. What happened? Mm-hmm. So I try to explain that analytically, and that's kind of my social science, political science hat. Within that is a sub-story of the Obama administration, because in 2009, we had a policy that we called Reset, where we managed to get in a more cooperative relationship with Russia, and in particular with Russian President Dmitry Medvedev. And that ended in a much more confrontational way back in 2012, and really punctuated with Russia's intervention in Ukraine. So I want to explain the story of the Obama, the arc of that story. It looked good, things were going well, and then not. Right. And then the third story weaved in there is my own personal story of, starting when I was a kid, as we talked about earlier, and my engagement with Russia and my optimism about closer relations, and then what happened with my own views, right? So I try to weave those through. You know, I've written many books, but they've all been academic books. I've never used the word I ever in a book before. So this is a big experiment for me to try to bounce back and forth. And it's not just a memoir either. It's somewhere in between. And you know, it's a very unique design in that way. And so we jump around from big theories of international relations to, doing the two-step, in Spaso House and trying to use, and I did. I was a pretty, I think both would agree that I was a unique ambassador. I'm trying to use a neutral word. Some loved it, some hated it. But I tried to experiment with unique ways to try to engage with the state, but also Russian society, and all of Russian society, not just the elites, but we had a kind of game plan to do that. And I was one of the first ambassadors, for instance, to use Twitter. That was brand new. Secretary Clinton said to me, she said, Mike, when you go out there, deal with the Russian government, but reach out to society, and Twitter is one way you can do it. And it was, on balance, I think it was a great thing because it allowed, the deputy foreign minister of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs to engage with me on Twitter, but also the high school kid in Vladivostok. And that was pretty shocking that a U.S. ambassador would respond to a Twitter. Twitter wasn't the only platform. We used other ones, but and that would really mix things up and I think created a different image of who I was and who our country was. But I mentioned the two-step because we talked about Montana. So one of my first events, and I was an accidental ambassador. Remember, I wasn't planning to be an ambassador. Most academics just spend 2 years in the government and then come back. They have to, usually. Stanford's a little more accommodating. But, the president didn't want me to leave the government, and so this was his idea to keep me in the government working Russia, but with a new job. So we arrive, and suddenly we're living in this giant mansion. It's called Spaso House. Your listeners can look it up and take a virtual tour. It's this incredible, 19th century mansion. Wow. And one of the first events in our 600-person capacity ballroom, that's part of our house. My kids used to play badminton in there in the wintertime because it was that big. Was a group from Montana, actually, a country western group coming from Montana. It had been scheduled before me. Yeah. It was just a coincidence. And they're lining up the seats for this concert. And I'm looking at it, and I'm like, where's the dance floor? And they were like, oh, Mr. Ambassador, we don't dance at Spaso House. This is a concert, right? It's very formal. And I'm like, we got to at least leave open the possibility that people might want to react to the music. And, and remember, my father's a country western musician, and the worst night at a gig, he would come home is when everybody just sit on their hands. That's the worst night of all. And we had a big argument with the staff, and they agreed, let's just take 3 rows out. And I got up. I know how to do the two-step, not that well, but I pulled it off. And the minute I got up, 30 seconds later, there were 100 people dancing, and Russians and Americans, and all the drama between Putin and Obama, people had forgotten about, and it was a great way to kind of connect. And culture oftentimes is a great way to connect. And that was a fun night. Yeah, and it really sounds like you brought some of yourself to that. Exactly. And that seems to be a really essential theme kind of in the book, too. You brought yourself into your scholarship and said, look, it's not just about this. I'm a person that is interacting within this context. Right. Yeah. Very, very interesting. If you ever get the chance to be ambassador, take it. It was a great job. Well, if you ever call me and offer me the job, I will gladly say yes, sir. Let's be in touch. Okay. I'm curious what you would think are the top issues that Americans should be aware of when it comes to understanding international concepts and diplomacy and their own involvement with all of that. Yeah. Well, one, they should be involved because we are a democracy and we have the opportunity to constrain and shape the way the White House and the State Department does foreign policy. And I think we sometimes, in our history, some of the worst chapters in our history was when the public was not engaged. Mm-hmm. And we just kind of left it up to the experts. I think the decision to invade Iraq in particular lingers with me as a time that I wish there would have been more societal engagement, members of Congress engagement, media to analyze that decision a little closer. And in the new era we're in now with a relatively new president that has some, trying to think a diplomatic way, he has some rather exotic ideas about foreign policy. I think it's a time that we should be vigilant and watching and educate yourself about what's going on, because it can make a difference. It most certainly was surprising to me when I was in the government how much we did care about public opinion and what people thought. There is that ability to be engaged. And I myself feel an obligation to also be engaged, to help educate. So I'm on TV. I speak in Washington and New York, but I also speak in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And
on pokey radio shows under Stanford's basement.
Exactly, because I want to be part of that process. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is, things are changing because of technology, and we are not quite ready for those changes, right? And one of them that we experienced in our election in 2016 was the role that external actors, in this case Russia, but there will be many, many more, will seek to play in influencing politics inside our country and using our technologies, right? Using our companies, Facebook and Twitter and Google, right? To have the ability to do that. And with that, it's one of the projects with several colleagues here I'm working on right now about disinformation, right? And the manipulation of what appears to be facts, but in fact, are distortions. I experienced that as an ambassador back in 2012. I was the target of a lot of Russian disinformation. Mm-hmm. Just blatant things were said about me that were false. Yeah. But how do you fight with it? How do you try to push back on it? Turns out it's pretty complicated. What's an example? Well, the grossest example was one day a video appeared on YouTube suggesting I was a pedophile. Yeah. Pretty awful. Right. What do you do with that? You ignore it? Well, then if you're ignoring it, people think about it. You would, and I just hesitated with you. I don't know if you noticed, because I don't, because once you mention it, right, then all of a sudden people's brains are thinking about it in different ways, right? And you somehow broadcast it by even mentioning it, right? And it's like giving credence to something, right? Where's the fine line? Right. I mean, another one was they used to accuse me of giving money to the opposition to Putin, and they would run videos with like the back of some guy's head that kind of looked like me, mysteriously handing out money, and it would just looked enough that it could be true that people would believe it. Well, that technology is advancing at a rapid pace. Yeah. And it's just around the corner when there's going to be videos of people speaking and words are going to be spliced in, and it's going to be very difficult to know whether that is them speaking or not. And so that dimension of how we protect our democracy and make decisions about who rules us based on Americans, not outsiders, that is a dimension that demands a lot more attention. Yeah, yeah. Now, I'm curious because, you spoke about your own, I'm going to get you out of here in a few minutes. Yeah, no. But you spoke about your own sort of desire to be involved. And I'm wondering at the level of government, what is the government's responsibility to get people engaged with government? That's a great question. That's a great question. I don't have a great answer. Yeah. I mean, philosophically, as somebody who believes in small d democracy, right? Not Democratic Party versus Republican, but engagement. I always want more. I think that leads to better outcomes, and it leads to constraints on really bad outcomes. That's maybe another way to put it. Like, President Obama used to say, don't do stupid things as part of our foreign policy. So just not doing stupid things is an achievement. To what extent the government should take that responsibility, I mean, I think we should. And most certainly when I was in the government, we did that all the time. We used to engage with civic leaders and, the U.S. Congress, the media, to try to tell our story. But there were others that thought that was a bad idea, like too much transparency and diplomacy constrains what you can do. So that's why I'm hesitant. It's a great question. I'll think more about it, and I'll get back to you.
I can't wait to hear your answer.
Okay.
Yeah. I always just think with the proliferation of media and the way we all have expectation for a certain level of engagement in the things we see.
Good point.
We're really looking for a higher level of engagement with just the way we get information. We go to a Hollywood movie, we expect huge explosions and something that really is gripping.
That's a good point.
And then we watch the news and it's like, change the channel. That's kind of boring, right?
That's a problem.
Yeah.
We got to figure out a better way to communicate. I agree with that.
Yeah. Well, I do think we're just about out of time. So I wanted to ask, is there a last thing you would like to leave the audience with, a piece of idea or encouragement or something that you just would like to leave them with to think about?
Buy the book. Book's out May 8th. And here's my pledge in the spirit of engagement. After the book's been out for a couple weeks, I will advertise on Twitter. I'm at McFaul. You can find me on Twitter. And we'll do some virtual seminars where I used to do this as ambassador. And I really enjoyed them because for an hour I would be there with my staff and we would, try to interact with all Russian questions. So I'm going to do that with the book.
Oh, great.
So everybody go do your homework, buy the book, read it, and then look for me on Twitter and we'll have a virtual conversation. We'll keep it going.
Excellent. So we have to say something along the lines of, if you're interested, go get the book. You can engage with you to extend that conversation and really be able to interact with these ideas. If it grips you, you're going to offer a chance to extend that. And
I'll be there.
Oh, that's awesome.
I guarantee you I will engage.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, and I think people will be very lucky to get that chance with you. So, again, thank you for coming on the show. It's been
Thanks for having me.
Such a joy to hear all the things you have to say. Absolutely. Okay, so I am the host of Modern Education, Ben Woodford. You are here with the professor Michael McFaul from Stanford University. He is an amazing man with wonderful ideas and formerly working with the president and just so many great things. So if you want to check out his book, that'd be a great thing. And again, thank you for tuning in. We will catch you every Friday from 3 to 4 here on KZSU 90.1 Stanford.
To revisit the content from today's show or hear previous episodes, you can find us on YouTube and Facebook by searching for Modern Education. Make sure to come back next week as we continue the conversation and visit new topics connected to learning in all its modern form. The show is written, produced, and hosted by Benjamin S. Woodford. I'm the announcer, Darlene Franklin, and this has been a production of 90.1 KZSU Stanford. See you next week for more Modern Education.